They called it the Green Hell. June 1944. Weeks after D-Day, the largest invasion force in history was trapped, bleeding, and on the verge of catastrophic failure. Not by panzers, not by the Luftwaffe, but by hedges, ancient earthen walls that turned Normandy into a meat grinder, and the Allies had no answer. This is the story of a nightmare so profound it was almost erased from the history books, and the impossible situation that would force one forgotten sergeant to attempt the insane. The world remembers the triumph of D-Day, the heroic storming of the beaches, the foothold seized on Fortress Europe. But what came next was a descent into a kind of warfare nobody had predicted. A brutal, intimate, and claustrophobic battle in a landscape that seemed designed by the devil himself. The Allied High Command had a plan, a meticulously crafted timetable. They expected to be miles inland, racing towards Paris within weeks. Instead, they were stuck in a sprawling green labyrinth known as the Bocage. These weren't the charming garden hedges of the English countryside. The Normandy hedgerows were monstrous. For over 1,000 years, farmers had piled earth, stone, and rock to mark their fields. Over centuries, trees and thorny bushes grew into these mounds, their roots weaving into a dense, almost concrete-like mass. Some stood 15 feet high and were just as thick. They were not fences. They were fortifications, natural, ancient, and deadly. For the American GI, every single field was an ambush, a self-contained fortress. To advance, you had to cross one field, fight your way to the hedgerow, breach it under fire, and then do it all over again in the next field, which could be less than 100 yards away. The Germans, masters of defense, understood this terrain perfectly. They let the Allies come, funneling them into pre-sighted killing zones. A machine gun here, a mortar team there. Every hedgerow was a new front line. But for the crews of the M4 Sherman tank, the situation was far, far worse. It was a daily, waking nightmare. The Sherman was a good tank, fast, reliable, and mechanically sound. But it had a fatal flaw. Its underside, the belly of the beast, was protected by shockingly thin armor. It was its Achilles heel, and the hedgerows were perfectly designed to expose it. Imagine you are a tank commander. Your orders are to advance. Ahead of you is a massive wall of green. Your only option is to go over it. Your driver pushes the throttle, and the 30-ton machine lurches forward. The tracks claw for purchase on the earthen bank. The nose of your Sherman tilts skyward, rising higher and higher, exposing the soft, vulnerable belly of your tank to whatever is waiting on the other side. And there was always something waiting. A German soldier, hidden in a foxhole, armed with a Panzerfaust, a simple, disposable anti-tank rocket. To him, the belly of your tank, silhouetted against the sky, is an unmissable target. He doesn't need to be a hero. He just needs to wait and pull a trigger. The result was always the same. A hollow metallic thump, followed by a catastrophic explosion. The Panzerfaust's shaped charge would pierce the thin armor like a white-hot knife through butter, spraying the inside of the tank with molten metal and superheated gas. The ammunition would ignite. The fuel would vaporize. The Sherman would erupt into a column of fire and black smoke. The crews called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter slogan, because they lit up first time, every time. This wasn't an occasional loss. It was a slaughter. Day after day, the hedgerows claimed more tanks, more crews. Men who had survived the horrors of the D-Day beaches were being incinerated in these quiet, green fields. Medics were overwhelmed. Morale plummeted. The advance slowed from miles per day to a bloody crawl measured in yards. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, watched in horror as his armored divisions were being systematically dismantled. The problem was so severe, it threatened the entire Normandy campaign. If the Allies couldn't break out of the Bocage, they could be contained, and eventually, perhaps, even pushed back into the sea. The High Command threw every solution they could think of at the problem. Engineers tried using massive bulldozers to clear paths, but they were slow, vulnerable, and drew immense fire. They tried packing explosives into pipes and detonating them at the base of the hedgerows, but this was incredibly dangerous and time-consuming. Some even tried mounting enormous plows to the front of tanks. Nothing worked effectively. The hedgerows were too dense, too ancient. They resisted every conventional solution. The Allied Army, the most technologically advanced fighting force on the planet, was being defeated by medieval farming boundaries. The situation was desperate. They needed a miracle. They needed a new idea. And it wouldn't come from a general's briefing room. It would come from the mind of one man, a man who watched this carnage unfold daily. A man with no college education, no engineering degree, just a deep, intuitive understanding of steel, leverage, and force. His name was Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. And he was getting tired of watching his friends burn. Cullen wasn't an officer. He wasn't a planner. Before the war, he was a garage mechanic in New Jersey. He fixed trucks, tuned engines, and solved the everyday problems of stubborn machinery. People underestimated mechanics. They saw grease under the fingernails and assumed a lack of intellectual firepower. They were wrong. Every good mechanic is a problem solver at heart. A puzzle master. You learn to look at a broken system, understand how its parts interact, and see the simple, elegant solution that others miss. Day after day, Cullen watched the Shermans try to climb. He watched them tilt, expose their bellies, and die. He saw the fire, the smoke, the stretchers, and as he watched yet another tank become a funeral pyre, a thought clicked in his mind. A thought so simple it was revolutionary. Everyone was looking at the problem the same way. They were trying to go over the hedgerow, or obliterate it with overwhelming force. Cullen saw it differently. The problem wasn't the hedgerow itself. The problem was the angle of attack. What if you didn't have to go over it at all? What if you could go through it? If a tank could somehow punch through the hedgerow at ground level, its thick frontal armor would remain facing the enemy. It would never expose its vulnerable belly. The Germans couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. The logic was flawless. The physics were sound. But the execution, that was the impossible part. How do you drive a 30-ton tank through a solid wall of earth, stone, and ancient roots? The hedgerows had stood for 1,000 years. They weren't going to give way to a gentle push. You needed to apply immense force in a very specific way. You needed teeth. You needed giant steel tusks that could rip and tear through the earth, severing the roots and creating a path. Cullen pulled out a small, dog-eared notebook he always carried and began to sketch. Crude drawings of steel prongs, blades, and cutters welded to the front of a Sherman. His crewmates watched him, a mix of amusement and pity in their eyes. "Cullen's at it again," they'd joke. "Gonna solve the whole war with his little drawings." They liked him, but the skepticism was thick. Generals with engineering degrees from West Point hadn't solved this. What chance did a sergeant from New Jersey have? He ignored them. He was lost in the puzzle. The angles had to be right. The steel had to be strong enough. The welds had to hold against an impact that could shatter bone. He knew he could do it. He just needed the materials. And he needed permission from an officer willing to take a chance on a crazy idea from a mad mechanic. The source of his solution, ironically, was lying right under his nose, rusting on the very beaches the Allies had fought so hard to capture. The Germans had littered the D-Day beaches with thousands of anti-tank obstacles. The most common were called Czech hedgehogs, massive, six-pronged jacks made of heavy, hardened steel beams welded together. They were designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft and stop tanks in their tracks. In the chaos of the invasion, most had been bypassed. Now, they were just scrap metal. Dangerous, heavy scrap metal. But to Sergeant Cullen, they were a godsend. The steel was perfect, hardened, thick, and already shaped into beams. If he could cut them apart with a welding torch and re-weld them to the front of a tank, he could create the very tusks he'd been dreaming of. The idea was crystallizing. It was no longer a vague concept. It was a concrete plan. A damaged but mobile Sherman tank, an acetylene torch, and the discarded weapons of his enemy. Now came the hardest part, convincing someone in authority to let him try. In the rigid hierarchy of the Army, a sergeant doesn't just walk up to a captain and propose welding scrap metal to a multi-million-dollar piece of war machinery. It was a career-ending suggestion. At best, he'd be laughed out of the tent. At worst, he could be disciplined for wasting time on a crackpot theory while a war was raging. Cullen found his commanding officer, Captain Samuel Morrison, studying a map, his face etched with worry. The red pins marking enemy strong points far outnumbered the blue pins of Allied advances. Cullen took a deep breath, saluted, and made his pitch. He explained the flaw in their current tactics. He described the carnage he witnessed daily. And then he laid out his insane, brilliant plan. He wanted to take a damaged Sherman, weld the scavenged steel prongs from Czech hedgehogs to its front, and ram it full speed into a solid wall of earth. Captain Morrison stared at him in stunned silence. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and intrigue. "Sergeant," he said slowly, "let me get this straight. Your plan is to deliberately drive a tank into a wall." "Yes, sir," Cullen replied, his voice steady. "The current plan is to drive over the wall, where they get shot in the belly and burn. My plan keeps our thickest armor facing the enemy at all times. They can't kill what they can't penetrate." The logic was undeniable. It was simple. It was brutal. And it was completely untested. Morrison was a good officer. He knew the official solutions weren't working. He knew he was losing good men every single day to this unsolvable problem. Taking a chance on a sergeant's wild idea was a massive risk, but doing nothing was a guaranteed path to failure. He looked at the map, then back at the determined face of the mechanic standing before him. He made a decision that would echo through history. "How long would it take you to build this contraption?" he asked. "Give me 2 days, sir," Cullen said, his heart pounding. "A welding crew, and permission to scavenge those hedgehogs." Morrison nodded slowly. "You have 48 hours, Sergeant. If this thing works, you might just be a hero. If it fails, we're both going to have a lot to answer for." The clock was ticking. Cullen had his permission. Now, he had to turn a desperate sketch into a war-winning machine before the green hell of Normandy consumed them all. The clock had started. 48 hours. That was all Sergeant Curtis Cullen had to turn a wild sketch into a machine that could break the stalemate in Normandy. With nothing but a borrowed welding torch, a handful of skeptical men, and scrap metal scavenged from the enemy, he was in a race against time. This wasn't just about building a weapon. It was about proving a mad idea could save them all, before it killed him first. The moment Captain Morrison gave the order, the weight of the entire Normandy campaign seemed to land on Sergeant Cullen's shoulders. It was one thing to have an idea in the quiet of your own mind. It was another to be told to make it real, with lives hanging in the balance. Failure was not an option, but success was a very, very long shot. His first task was to build a team. He didn't need engineers from a university. He needed men who understood the language of steel, men who could feel the strength of a weld and see the flaw in an angle. He found them in the motor pool. Men like him covered in grease and grit. One of them was Private Eddie Kowalski, a welder from Chicago with hands as steady as a surgeon's and a deeply pessimistic outlook on life. "You want us to do what, Sarge?" Kowalski asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Weld giant metal spikes to the front of a Sherman? You know that front plate is case-hardened, right? You apply too much heat, it'll turn brittle. First thing that hits it, the whole plate could shatter." Kowalski was right. This was the first of 100 technical hurdles. Welding onto a tank's main armor was incredibly risky. A bad weld could compromise the very thing that kept the crew alive. But Cullen had already thought of that. "We're not welding directly to the glacis plate," he explained, pulling out his notebook. "We're going to build a mounting assembly that bolts onto the forward transmission cover. The final drive assembly. It's one of the strongest parts of the whole tank. The impact force will be distributed there, not on the armor." Kowalski stared at the sketch, his skepticism slowly turning into grudging respect. The mechanic from New Jersey had done his homework. The plan was still crazy, but it wasn't stupid. Cullen gathered a small crew, and their first stop was a place of ghosts and twisted metal: the D-Day landing beaches. Weeks after the invasion, the beaches were an eerie boneyard. Wrecked landing craft, burned-out vehicles, and everywhere, the menacing shapes of German obstacles. Cullen's prize was there, half buried in the sand: the Czech hedgehogs. These weren't small. Each one was a monster of 3 interlocking steel I-beams, weighing hundreds of pounds, designed to stop a tank dead in its tracks. Now, Cullen planned to use their strength for the exact opposite purpose. The work was brutal and dangerous. With acetylene torches, they began dissecting the metal beasts. Sparks flew as the white-hot flames sliced through the thick German steel. The beams were heavy, awkward, and razor-sharp on the cut edges. It was back-breaking labor under a nervous sky. The front line was only miles away. The dull crump of artillery was a constant reminder that they were on the clock. As they worked, they felt the profound irony of the moment. They were taking the enemy's defensive weapons, the very steel meant to kill them as they landed, and forging them into a spearhead for their own advance. It was a perfect metaphor for battlefield ingenuity, turning a shield into a sword. They hauled the heavy beams back to a makeshift field workshop, hidden behind a bombed-out French farmhouse. There, a battle-scarred Sherman waited for them. It had been hit by an anti-tank gun, its main gun damaged beyond repair, but its engine and tracks were still functional. It was the perfect test vehicle. Cullen ran his hand over the scarred hull. This tank had failed in its last fight. He was about to give it a second chance at vengeance. The next 24 hours were a blur of fire, steel, and sweat. Cullen was everywhere at once. He was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of grinders, torches, and sledgehammers. Using chalk, he meticulously marked the cut lines on the steel beams. They had to be uniform, around 4 feet long, with the tips sharpened to a crude but effective point. "Think of it like a plowshare," he told his men. "It doesn't have to be a razor. It just needs to bite into the earth and not let go." They worked through the night, the glare of the welding torches lighting up the ruined farm. The rhythmic hiss of the flame was the only sound, a stark contrast to the distant rumble of the war. This was a different kind of battle, a battle of angles and tolerances, of heat and pressure. Every weld had to be perfect. A single weak spot could cause a prong to snap off at the moment of impact, potentially crippling the tank, or sending a multi-hundred-pound steel spear flying through the air. As the sun rose on the second day, the basic shape was coming together. They had fabricated the heavy mounting plate that would bolt to the Sherman's final drive assembly. Now came the most critical part: attaching the 4 steel tusks. Cullen used a protractor and a plumb line, obsessing over the angle. It was the secret to the entire invention. "They have to be angled down," he explained to Kowalski. "About 15 degrees. If they're straight, they might just skip off the top of the hedgerow. If they're angled too far down, they'll dig in like an anchor and stop us dead. But this angle, it should lift the earth and sever the roots, using the tank's own forward momentum to do the work." It was pure intuitive engineering. There were no computers, no simulations, no blueprints. It was just a mechanic's gut feeling, born from a lifetime of understanding how machines interact with the physical world. As Kowalski laid the final, perfect welds, soldiers from nearby units began to gather. Word had spread about the mad mechanic and his porcupine tank. The onlookers were a mix of curious, hopeful, and deeply skeptical. "You really think that'll work?" one infantryman asked. "Looks like it's liable to just get stuck." Another joked, "I don't know, but I wouldn't want to see that thing coming at me." The pressure was immense. Cullen's project was no longer a secret. If it failed, it would be a very public and embarrassing one. Captain Morrison arrived to check on their progress. He walked around the modified tank, his expression unreadable. The 4 steel prongs extended from the front, like the fangs of some prehistoric beast. It looked brutal, agricultural, and utterly insane. He kicked one of the prongs with his boot. It didn't budge. He examined Kowalski's welds, thick and clean. "It's formidable, Sergeant," Morrison said, unable to find a better word. "Are you confident it will hold?" "The welds are stronger than the steel itself, sir," Kowalski chimed in, proud of his work. "The design is sound, Captain," Cullen added. "The physics will work. Now we just have to prove it." By dusk on the second day, 48 hours after they'd begun, the final bolts were tightened. The job was done. The tank, which the crew had affectionately nicknamed Rhinoceros, was a terrifying sight to behold. It had transformed the familiar silhouette of the Sherman into something alien and aggressive. It no longer looked like a cavalry vehicle. It looked like a siege engine. The gathered soldiers fell silent as Cullen and his chosen test crew approached the machine. For the driver's seat, Corporal Jake Mitchell, a man known for his steady nerves. At the gunner's position, Sergeant Tom Harrison. They were volunteers. They were putting their lives in the hands of a mechanic's theory. They climbed inside and buttoned the hatches. The engine coughed to life with a roar, spewing black diesel smoke. Cullen didn't get in. He stood with Captain Morrison and a group of officers who had come to witness the test. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had checked every weld, every bolt, every calculation a dozen times. But theory was one thing. Reality was 30 tons of steel meeting 1,000 years of stubborn earth. Anything could go wrong. The prongs could snap. The mounting could shear off. The tank could get hopelessly stuck, becoming an easy target. Or, as Kowalski had first warned, the shock could fracture the tank's main armor. A fatal and invisible wound. Cullen had put these men's lives on the line. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. They had chosen the perfect victim, a monstrous hedgerow nearby that had resisted all previous attempts to breach it. It was a 15-foot-tall behemoth, thick with ancient trees and tangled roots. It was the very definition of an immovable object. The Rhinoceros was about to become the irresistible force. "All right, Sergeant," Morrison said grimly. "You've built your monster. Let's see if it can hunt." Cullen could only nod, his mouth too dry to speak. He watched the tank he had willed into existence lumber towards the green wall. This was it, the moment of truth. The next 60 seconds would determine if he was a genius or a fool. The fate of the Normandy campaign and the lives of the men inside that tank rested on his 48-hour miracle. Captain Morrison raised his arm, holding it for a long, tense moment. The only sound was the throaty rumble of the Sherman's engine and the chirping of birds, oblivious to the history about to be made. Then his arm dropped. The signal was given. The engine roared to a crescendo. The Rhinoceros lurched forward, picking up speed, its steel tusks aimed at the heart of the ancient barrier. 20 yards out! 10 yards! The officers held their breath. Cullen felt a cold dread wash over him. What have I done? The impact was a cataclysm of sound and fury. A thunderous crack echoed across the fields as steel met earth. The entire tank shuddered violently, dirt and debris exploding outwards in a massive cloud. Roots as thick as a man's arm snapped with reports like rifle fire. For a terrifying second, the tank seemed to stop, its momentum utterly absorbed by the sheer mass of the hedgerow. It had failed. A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Cullen's heart sank into his stomach. But then, something incredible happened. Through the dust cloud, they could hear the Sherman's engine screaming, not in failure, but in raw, unyielding effort. The tracks were churning, digging into the soil, pushing with all the power of its 400-horsepower engine. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the rhinoceros began to move. The prongs had bitten deep, just as Cullen had predicted. They weren't just pushing. They were ripping. They were creating leverage, tearing through the root system, lifting and displacing tons of earth. The tank tilted forward slightly, nose down, keeping its thick frontal armor pointed forward, its vulnerable belly protected. The screaming of the engine grew louder, the snapping of roots more frequent. And then, with a final groaning tear, the rhinoceros burst through the other side of the hedgerow, emerging into the next field, trailing dirt and vines like a victorious beast. It hadn't just made a hole. It had created a clean, wide breach, a perfect doorway for other tanks and infantry to follow. A stunned silence fell over the officers. Then it was broken by a single soldier whooping with joy. The silence shattered into a chorus of cheers. It worked. The mad, impossible idea had actually worked. The hatches on the Rhino popped open, and Corporal Mitchell emerged, grinning from ear to ear. "That was the smoothest ride I've ever had through a hedge, Sarge," he yelled. "We barely felt a thing." Cullen felt his knees go weak with relief. He had done it. But as Captain Morrison clapped him on the back, a grim-faced major from Division Headquarters stepped forward. "Congratulations, Sergeant," the major said, his voice cold. "You've proven it can punch through a bush. Now you have to prove it can survive a real fight. Tomorrow morning, you're taking it into combat." The test was over. The trial was about to begin. Sergeant Cullen's invention had torn through a wall of dirt, but now it had to face bullets, shells, and the elite German panzer divisions. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was ordered to ride inside his creation on a suicide mission against a fortified enemy strongpoint. One tank, one untested weapon, against an enemy that had never been breached. Dawn over Normandy broke with a cold, miserable drizzle. The world was shades of gray and mud. Inside the hastily assembled briefing tent, the atmosphere was thick with tension. A map lay on the table, showing a German position designated Hill 192. For 3 days, it had been a thorn in the side of the American advance. A fortress surrounded by a maze of ancient, impenetrable hedgerows. Every attempt to take it had been thrown back with bloody losses. Today, they were trying something new. All eyes were on Sergeant Cullen's modified Sherman, the Rhinoceros. It was to be the spearhead, the battering ram that would smash a path for the infantry to follow. But this was no mere test. This was a live-fire, do-or-die assault. And then came the order that made Cullen's blood run cold. "Sergeant, you'll ride with Mitchell's crew," Captain Morrison stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You'll act as technical advisor. If something goes wrong with that device, you need to be there to see why." Cullen's mind reeled. He was a mechanic, a builder, not a frontline tanker. But he understood the brutal logic. If his invention had a fatal flaw, he needed to witness it firsthand so it wouldn't kill more men down the line. He was a guinea pig for his own experiment. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Understood, sir." A grim-faced Private Chen, the tank's loader, found him a few minutes later, checking and rechecking every weld on the Rhinoceros by the dim light of a lantern. "You scared, Sarge?" Chen asked quietly. Cullen didn't lie. "Terrified," he admitted. "Yesterday, we were fighting a pile of dirt. Today, people's lives depend on whether I got the math right." Chen clapped a hand on his shoulder. "We trust you, Sarge. You built this thing. You know it. Now, let's go show the Germans they can't hide from us anymore." The simple faith of the crew was both a comfort and a crushing burden. Cullen climbed into the commander's cupola of the Rhinoceros. The smell of oil, sweat, and fear was overpowering. The hatch slammed shut, sealing them in a world of echoing steel. "Mount up!" the order came crackling over the radio. Across the staging area, engines rumbled to life. The rhinoceros shuddered as Corporal Mitchell engaged the gears. It began to roll forward, its 4 steel prongs gleaming wetly in the dawn light, pointing towards the enemy. The plan was simple and insane. They would charge directly at the hedgerows the Germans were using for cover, breach them, and sow chaos before the enemy could react. They approached the first hedgerow. Intelligence said a German MG-42 machine gun nest, a Hitler's buzzsaw, was dug in on the other side, a position that had pinned down an entire platoon of infantry yesterday. The familiar chatter of the machine gun started, bullets sparking harmlessly off their frontal armor. In a normal Sherman, this was the moment of maximum danger. The climb, the exposure, the inevitable fiery death. "Steady, Mitchell," Cullen yelled over the intercom. "Hit it at about 20 degrees, give the prongs a good bite." "Roger that." Mitchell's voice was tense but firm. The tank charged. The impact was a bone-jarring crash. Inside, the men were thrown against their restraints. The sound was deafening, a tortured screech of metal and snapping roots. The tank pushed, the engine howling in protest. And then they were through. They burst into the field to the sight of a shocked German machine gun crew scrambling for their weapon, their faces a mask of disbelief. An American tank wasn't supposed to be able to do that. The Sherman's coaxial machine gun spoke first, silencing the threat permanently. Behind them, a platoon of American infantry poured through the gap the rhinoceros had created, cheering as they advanced. "It works!" Chen shouted, his voice electric with adrenaline. "It actually works in combat." There was no time to celebrate. The next hedgerow loomed, and the next. Again and again, the rhinoceros performed its brutal magic. It smashed through barriers that had been death sentences just hours before. For the infantry following them, it was a miracle. They were advancing, taking ground, and for the first time in weeks, they weren't being cut to pieces in the open. But the Germans were adapting. They were realizing this was no fluke. As the rhinoceros breached another hedge, the terrifying whoosh of a Panzerfaust streaked past the turret. Someone on the other side was waiting for them. "They're catching on!" Harrison the gunner yelled. "They're waiting for the breach." But they were still too slow. The rhinoceros was through the hedge and on top of them before they could reload. They had punched deep into the German defenses, deeper than any Allied armor had managed to go in this sector. But now came the real test. Intelligence had warned of it. Dug in behind the final massive hedgerow guarding the approach to the hill was a Panther. The German Panther tank was the apex predator of the Normandy battlefield. Its sloped frontal armor was almost impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun, while its own long-barreled, high-velocity cannon could kill a Sherman from over a mile away. It was a monster. Getting into a head-to-head fight with a Panther in a Sherman was suicide. "Contact! Front!" Harrison called out, his voice strained. "Panther! Partial cover behind the main hedgerow. I can just see the barrel." The radio crackled. The infantry were pinned down. They couldn't advance with that Panther waiting. Retreat was the sensible option. Call for an airstrike or an artillery barrage. Play it safe. That was the old way of thinking. Cullen's mind raced. The entire point of his invention was to break the rules, to do the unexpected. Speed was their only advantage. "Breach the hedge, Mitchell," Cullen ordered, his voice ringing with authority. "Don't stop for anything. We go through fast. Harrison, keep your gun trained on his last known position. The moment we're through, you fire. Don't wait." It was a breathtaking gamble. They were deliberately charging a hidden Tiger tank. Mitchell didn't hesitate. The Sherman surged forward, engines screaming, charging the thickest hedgerow they had yet faced. The impact was titanic. The entire tank felt like it had hit a concrete wall. For a gut-wrenching moment, they stalled, the prongs fighting against a century of compacted earth and stone. "More power!" Cullen roared. "Give it everything!" Mitchell slammed the throttle to the floor. The engine howled, threatening to tear itself apart. Smoke poured from the exhaust. The tracks threw up geysers of mud, and inch by agonizing inch, the rhinoceros clawed its way through the green wall. They burst through at an angle, lurching violently into the open field. And there it was, less than 100 yards away, the panther. Its massive turret was already turning to face them, the crew inside no doubt shocked by their sudden, violent appearance. But they were a fraction of a second too late. Harrison was already on target. "Firing!" he yelled. The Sherman's main gun bucked. The armor-piercing round shot across the field. In a straight-on fight, the round would have bounced harmlessly off the panther's thick frontal armor. But because the rhinoceros had breached at an unexpected angle, Harrison had a clean shot at its weaker side armor. The round struck true, a bright flash, and the shell penetrated. The German tank shuddered to a halt. Thick black smoke began to pour from its hatches. The fight was over. The Panther's crew bailed out, hands in the air, as the rhinoceros's machine guns convinced them to surrender. The battle for Hill 192 was broken. With the Panther gone, the remaining German defenders lost their nerve. The American infantry surged forward, securing the position that had cost so much blood. It had taken the rhinoceros less than an hour to accomplish what the army had failed to do in 3 days. Cullen climbed out of the tank, his legs shaking, his ears ringing. He had done it. His crazy idea, born from watching his comrades die, had been tested under the most extreme pressure imaginable, and it had triumphed. An infantry officer, his face smeared with dirt and sweat, ran up to him, grinning broadly. "Sergeant Cullen, I don't know what kind of black magic you've got on this thing, but you just saved my entire company." Soon after, Captain Morrison arrived, his jeep bouncing over the cratered field. His radio was crackling with excited reports. "Sergeant, I just got off the line with division headquarters. General Bradley himself has heard the news. He wants a full report on my desk by noon. They're calling your invention the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter." Cullen could barely process it. General Bradley, the commander of over 1 million men, knew his name. "They're not just impressed, Cullen," Morrison continued, a look of awe on his face. "They're ecstatic. Major Williams's report from the test yesterday already had them interested. This combat report, it changes everything. They want to know one thing: how fast can we make more?" The question hung in the air, amidst the smoke and the smell of cordite. Cullen looked at the rhinoceros, its steel prongs bent but unbroken, caked with the soil of the enemy's fortress. He had proven the concept beyond any doubt. But one miracle tank wasn't enough to win the war. "Sir," Cullen said, the mind of the mechanic already turning over the new problem, "if I can get enough welders and an unlimited supply of those Czech hedgehogs from the beaches, my crew could modify maybe 12 tanks a day. If we really push it." The major who had been so skeptical before the test now reappeared, his face alight with a new kind of energy. "Not good enough, Sergeant," he said, but this time he was smiling. "I'm going to get you 50 welders. 100. I want every engineering battalion in Normandy working on this. We're not making 12. We're going to make thousands. Your invention is going into mass production, effective immediately." The victory at Hill 192 wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a revolution. Cullen's 48-hour miracle had survived its trial by fire. Now, it was about to be unleashed on the entire German army. One tank had changed a battle. Now, thousands would change the war. The Cullen Hedgerow Cutter was no longer a secret. It was the Allies' #1 priority. In a frantic, unprecedented effort, entire engineering battalions were turned into massive assembly lines, forging an army of steel-tusked monsters. This is the story of how a sergeant's invention was unleashed, and the German army learned to fear the sound of the rhino's charge. The victory at Hill 192 sent a shockwave through the Allied High Command. The impossible problem of the hedgerows now had a simple, brutal solution. The order came down from General Omar Bradley himself. "Get those things on every tank we have. Yesterday." Suddenly, Sergeant Curtis Cullen wasn't just a mechanic. He was the most valuable teacher in the U.S. Army. He was pulled from his unit and tasked with training hundreds of welders and engineers. Field depots behind the lines were transformed into chaotic, 24-hour factories. Tanks would roll in, caked with the mud of the front, and crews of welders would descend upon them. Cullen moved from depot to depot, a whirlwind of energy, chalk in hand. "The angle is everything," he'd shout over the roar of torches and generators. 15 degrees down. Weld it to the final drive assembly, not the glacis. Reinforce the welds here and here. He was teaching them his art, the practical science he had perfected, in 48 frantic hours. Some of the engineers, men with degrees and officers' commissions, were initially skeptical of taking orders from a sergeant. But their skepticism vanished when they saw the combat reports. This wasn't theory. This was a proven, life-saving, war-winning design. They listened, they learned, and they worked. The supply chains swung into action. Trucks rumbled back to the beaches day and night, hauling the remains of German-Czech hedgehogs to the depots. The very obstacles meant to stop the invasion were now fueling its breakout. Within a week, dozens of tanks had been converted. Within 2 weeks, hundreds. The Rhino tank was born. The Germans, for their part, were baffled. Their entire defensive strategy in Normandy was built around the static, fortress-like nature of the hedgerows. Suddenly, their fortresses had doors, and American tanks were kicking them in without warning. Captured after-action reports from this period reveal a state of utter confusion. Enemy armor is now passing through hedgerows at will, one German officer wrote. Method unknown. Our anti-tank positions are being bypassed and destroyed from the flank and rear. They tried to adapt. They laid mines at the base of hedgerows, hoping to disable the breaching tanks. But the Rhino's tusks would often trip the mines prematurely, or simply push them aside. They tried reinforcing the hedgerows with logs and steel beams, but this only slowed the Rhinos. It didn't stop them. The fundamental equation of the battlefield had changed. And it all came to a head in late July 1944. The Allies were ready to launch their masterstroke, Operation Cobra, a massive, concentrated offensive designed to finally, decisively break out of the Normandy pocket and begin the race across France. Thousands of bombers would carpet bomb the German lines, and then the armored divisions would punch through. This operation would have been impossible just weeks earlier. The hedgerows would have bogged it down, turning the assault into another meat grinder. But now they had the key. The Rhino tanks were massed at the front of the offensive. On July 25th, after the bombers had done their work, the order was given. An unstoppable tide of steel was unleashed. Hundreds of Shermans, each fitted with Cullen's steel teeth, charged the German lines. The effect was terrifying. They didn't just breach the hedgerows. They annihilated them. They crashed through the green walls simultaneously, on a front miles wide, shattering the German defensive network in a single, catastrophic blow. German soldiers who survived the bombing looked up from their foxholes, expecting a slow, cautious advance. Instead, they saw a horde of monstrous, tusked machines charging at them, appearing from nowhere, their guns already blazing. Panic set in. The German line didn't just bend, it shattered. Operation Cobra was a spectacular success, and the Rhino cutter was its unsung hero. The breakout had begun. The War of Inches was over. The race across France was on. General Bradley himself would later credit the Kulin hedgerow cutter as one of the 3 most important tactical innovations of the entire European theater. He personally sought out Cullen, who he found elbow-deep in Greece, training yet another crew. "Sergeant," Bradley said, extending a hand, "I came to see the man who unstuck my army." For his ingenuity, Cullen was awarded the Legion of Merit and given a field promotion. But as the Allies pushed beyond Normandy into the open country of France, the Rhino's story wasn't over. Soldiers, ever creative, found new and unexpected uses for the device. In urban warfare, the steel prongs were perfect for smashing through brick walls, clearing a path into buildings where snipers were hiding. The psychological impact of a 30-ton tank crashing through your living room wall was often enough to induce surrender on its own. During the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, the cutters acted like giant snowplows, clearing paths through deep drifts that would have otherwise stopped an armored column cold. In one famous incident, a Rhino crew used their cutter to physically push a disabled German Panther tank off a narrow road, clearing a path for the entire column to advance. The hedgerow cutter had become a multi-purpose battlefield tool. But Cullen himself remained conflicted. He was hailed as a hero, but he saw the cost. The rapid advance enabled by his invention strained supply lines to the breaking point. More profoundly, he wrestled with the purpose of his creation. "I made a tool that helped kill people more efficiently," he confided to a friend. It saved American lives, yes, but it feels wrong to be celebrated for it. He was a man who preferred fixing things, and war was the ultimate act of breaking them. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, thousands of tanks across Germany sat silent, their steel tusks pointing at a defeated enemy. Curtis Cullen returned home to New Jersey. He took off his uniform, put on his mechanic's overalls, and went back to fixing cars. He rarely, if ever, spoke of his invention. His neighbors, his customers, they had no idea that the quiet man who tuned their engines had changed the course of World War II. Decades later, a historian tracked him down. "Mr. Cullen," the historian asked, "don't you understand how important your invention was? You saved thousands of lives." Cullen, now an old man, was quiet for a long time. "My idea worked because people gave it a chance," he finally said. Captain Morrison could have said no. General Bradley could have dismissed it. The real lesson isn't that I was a genius. It's that good ideas can come from anywhere, if you're only willing to listen. Curtis Cullen passed away in 1963. His obituary just said he was a mechanic and a veteran, but his legacy is forged in steel, sitting in museums around the world. It's a testament to a timeless truth, that sometimes the biggest, most complex problems don't need a committee of experts or a billion-dollar solution. Sometimes all they need is a fresh pair of eyes, a little bit of scrap metal, and the simple, brilliant mind of a person who refuses to accept that something is impossible. The story of Curtis Cullen is more than just a forgotten chapter of World War II. It's a lesson in ingenuity, a reminder that the person with the solution is often the one closest to the problem. It proves that one person with a crazy idea, courage, and a welding torch can change the world. There are thousands of stories like his, buried in the archives of history, forgotten heroes, and secret innovations that turned the tide. If you want to uncover more of these declassified stories of the men
दे दो गांडू तो गाड़ी क्यों दे वो जो बस टेंशन ना कौन सा हाँ कैसे कब आज हो गया उसका नंबर आएंगे साथ यार असल में उसमें ऐसा हुआ तो गलतियाँ ऐसी हुई हैं कि मतलब मैं सोच भी रहा हूँ कि यार मैं इधर से ऐसे कर लूँ ये चीज़ मैंने गलत लिखी है फिर मैंने कहा मतलब चलो इसकी कटिंग करनी पड़ेगी दोबारा से लिखना पड़ेगा मेरे लंग करता है जो कुछ होना हो गया और यार ये बहुत मदर छोड़ यार गान कर दो यार मैं चले मारा था